Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the Emergency Solutions Grants Program Caper Report. I'm Marlisa Grogan and I'm joined today by my HUD colleague Susan Ziff. Also presenting with HUD today is Natalie Matthews from APT and Michelle Budzek from the Partnership Center is here as one of our resource advisors. Here is some info today about our format. The webinar will last approximately 90 minutes. A recorded version of this webinar, as well as the presentation materials, will be available on the OneCPD website. Feedback survey will be emailed to all participants. The webinar materials will be available on the Training and Events page of the OneCPD Resource Exchange in the course catalog within 1 week of this presentation. You can see the link to the course catalog circled on your screen, and you can use the Find By box shown here on the right side of your screen to filter hundreds of available training materials. A few housekeeping notes. Webinar participants will be muted throughout the call. To submit questions, concerns, or to seek technical assistance, use the Adobe Connect Questions dialog box up on the right of your screen in the Adobe Connect navigation bar. You may want to expand your screen to full size to see the slides optimally. Remember to minimize the screen again if you wish to submit a question. Your questions are important to HUD. However, the volume and complexity of the questions will determine whether we can answer your question during the webinar. If it's not addressed during the webinar or answered by one of our resource advisors, please submit it to the OneCPD Ask a Question at the web address on your screen. Today's webinar will focus on providing guidance to ESG recipients on preparing, completing, and submitting the ESG-only portion of the Caper using the eCon Planning Suite and IDIS. For the remainder of this webinar, we will refer to the ESG-only portion of the Caper as the ESG Caper, not to be confused with the entire Caper, which includes a general and other program-specific sections for the Community Development Block Grants, CDBG, Home Investment Partnerships, HOME, and Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS HOPWA programs. This webinar's intended audience is primarily ESG recipients, but HUD recognizes that ESG sub-recipients and continuums of care play a part in providing data to the recipient for Caper submission. Though this webinar will give sub-recipients and CoCs context about the Caper requirements and guidance on data collection for ESG, in all cases, it is the recipient that must complete and submit the Caper. This webinar is not intended to be a substitute for reading the ESG Caper notice, which is the basis of today's training. To effectively carry out the program requirements, recipients must read and be familiar with the notice requirements. You can access the notice by using a link that's included towards the end of the presentation that we'll provide for you. Today's objectives are to understand the basic data collection and reporting requirements for the ESG Caper, to become more familiar with the ESG Caper screens and IDIS, including recent fixes and necessary changes, and to identify solutions to common problems. So let's start with data collection and reporting requirements. Within 90 days after the end of its program year, a CONPLAN jurisdiction must provide an annual performance report known as the Caper to HUD that summarizes its performance for the program year. The ESG Caper is only one part of the CONPLAN jurisdiction's entire report, which includes screens such as CR25 homeless and special needs that apply to the CONPLAN jurisdiction as a whole, in addition to the program's specific Caper reporting requirements for each formula program. And I mentioned those before, CDBG Home and or HOPWA. This webinar focuses on the ESG program reporting requirements for the ESG Caper. Remember that this is a transition Caper for ESG. HUD anticipates that the ESG Caper will be updated to reflect the new HMIS data standards when finalized, and to further align the Caper with the COC Annual Performance Report, APR. Once the Caper is updated, HUD will expect recipients to report 100% of beneficiary data, not necessarily financial data, from HMIS and comparable databases. At this time, HUD cannot tell you when the screens will be released in IDIS, but we will issue guidance through the listserv. Currently, the Caper is the primary mechanism for ESG accomplishment reporting, since IDIS no longer contains beneficiary or accomplishment data screens for ESG, other than those screens contained in the Caper submission template. In addition to replacing ESG beneficiary data screens in IDIS, the ESG Caper template screens replace the Consolidated Plan Management Process, which you probably know as the CPMP tool, and corresponding tables that capture emergency shelter grants data. CPMP has not been updated to reflect the conforming amendments to the CON-Plan regulations. Therefore, ESG recipients are prohibited from using CPMP to complete the ESG Caper. ESG recipients that still have Emergency Shelter Grants Program performance data to report must incorporate that data into the ESG Caper screens in IDIS where applicable. So ESG recipients must complete the ESG Caper in IDIS, and this requirement applies to all ESG recipients, even if they're not using the eCon Planning Suite yet to complete the rest of their Caper. And along those lines, it's important that CON-Plan jurisdictions do not use IDIS to complete the non-ESG portions of the Caper until they have an approved annual action plan in the system. HUD published 2 notices, one of which I already mentioned, that provide more specific guidance. We include the links on the last few slides. The March 2010 HMIS data standards includes the data collection requirements for HUD-funded projects. The current ESG Caper consists of limited screens requiring data captured by HMIS program descriptor and universal data elements. Therefore, recipients must ensure that subrecipients are collecting data on the universal data elements. However, one table on the ESG Caper does require data on subpopulations served, which are captured by program-specific data elements in HMIS. Although not currently required, HUD encourages ESG recipients to use HMIS to collect data on program-specific data elements relevant to the Special Populations Served table on screen CR65. We will review this information in more detail shortly. If you're unfamiliar which data elements are universal or program-specific, or if this just sounds foreign to you, take a look at the 2010 HMIS data standards, which establishes all data elements. For financial data, HUD expects that recipients will use an internal financial reporting system to report expenditure data in the Caper. HMIS implementations are not required to provide an HMIS-generated report at the recipient level for ESG. And this is because HUD recognizes that not all ESG providers were contributing data to a COC's HMIS prior to the effective date of the ESG program interim rule. If the local HMIS does not have the functionality to combine all ESG data into one recipient-level report, ESG recipients are responsible for aggregating and reporting data from their subrecipients in order to complete the ESG Caper. We'll talk about available tools to assist in this effort, as well as specific subrecipient and recipient roles in a moment. ESG recipients should use data from HMIS to input as much data in the ESG template as is practical and reliable. In April 2013, HUD published the draft HMIS data standards. Once the data standards are finalized, recipients and their subrecipients will be required to use the new standards. As mentioned on the previous slide, ESG recipients should follow the final HMIS data standards notice, published March 10, 2010, until the proposed revisions to the HMIS data standards are made final. So let's review the ESG recipients role. This involves working with your local CoCs and HMIS leads to obtain the required data, ensure that all subrecipients provide you with the HMIS data necessary to complete the report, aggregating all subrecipients' data if an HMIS-generated recipient level report is unavailable, and completing the ESG Caper template screens in IDIS. In the ESG Caper webinar for HMIS leads presented last July, HUD advised HMIS system administrators to obtain the information in this table from ESG recipients. A list of all subrecipients, the street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention components funded by the recipient's ESG program, and the recipient's reporting period are all vital information that the HMIS system administrators need in order to properly set up their HMIS and generate the ESG Caper subrecipient report. HMISs must provide both subrecipients and those recipients that do not have subrecipients with the functionality to generate the ESG Caper subrecipient report. For recipients that do not have subs, once they have the ESG Caper subrecipient report, they're likely to have all the data necessary for screen CR65. Otherwise, subrecipients will provide this report to their recipient, and the recipient will then aggregate all of its subrecipient data in order to complete the CR65 Caper screen in IDIS. Now for the ESG subrecipient role. ESG subrecipients must use the local CoC's HMIS, must collect data on the universal, program descriptor, and program-specific data elements. And just a reminder note that currently recipients and subrecipients are not required but recommended to collect the program-specific data elements. As I briefly mentioned earlier, certain program-specific data elements, and when I say program-specific data elements, but I mean such as substance abuse, domestic violence, and mental illness. Those are some of the program-specific data elements in the special populations table. They're captured on screen CR65, and we're going to review that in the next section of the webinar. Other subrecipient responsibilities are submitting required HMIS data via the ESG Caper subrecipient report and financial expenditure information to their recipient. And finally, subrecipients are reminded not to submit the Caper. Only recipients might enter data into the eCon planning suite. Though subrecipients will likely be asked to provide information for all sections of the Caper, subrecipients must not enter data into IDIS. Here's a list of the data collection tools that HUD has made available to assist with completing the ESG Caper. ESG recipients may use the ESG Caper aggregation tool, and the purpose of that tool is to help recipients compile data from multiple subrecipients. But then there are also two ways that ESG subrecipients or recipients who don't have subs can compile their data for the Caper. And those two methods are either the ESG Program Caper report, which is programmed into the HMIS system by the vendors, or the ESG Program Caper generation tool, which generates an ESG Program Caper using data from their HMIS. Remember that the Caper is a snapshot that captures all recipient activity, meaning the funds expended and the program participants served during a specific reporting period, which is the recipient's program year. So subrecipient data must be collected for the same reporting period, which starts on the first day of the recipient's program year and ends on the last day of the recipient's program year. Links to these tools are available on the final slides of this presentation. So now let's transition into using IDIS for the ESG Program Caper. Here's an overview of the ESG Caper screens. So the ESG Caper template consists of 4 screens CR60 subrecipient information, CR65 ESG persons assisted, CR70 ESG assistance provided, and CR75 ESG expenditures. And here's an important note. Please be aware that ESG racial and ethnic data are not included on the ESG Caper screens. We'll talk about where this data is captured, as well as how to report the information in a few moments. But let's start by reviewing each screen on the ESG Caper template. As we go through each one, I will make note of recent updates and frequently asked questions submitted to the one CPD AAQ. Here's where it gets interesting because we actually have pictures. In order to start your caper, click Add on the left-hand side of the screen, which is circled in red. You'll be taken to the screen you see right now, where you will be prompted to enter the program year, a title of your choice, and the version number. Recipients can create multiple versions of Caper reports. You're free to use your own numbering convention, but the version cell won't allow you to use the same version number twice for the same program year. And that's intended to prevent you from mixing up multiple versions of the same report. So after this is done, click Save. Now those ESG recipients that already have an approved annual action plan in IDIS will see this menu screen after completing the CR00 administration screen. Links to all of the Caper screens, which are circled in red, are available in addition to the ESG Caper screens at the bottom of the list. ESG recipients that do not have an approved annual action plan in IDIS will not see this screen. Instead, you'll be prompted by the question, is this Caper for ESG? When there's no approved annual action plan in IDIS, and you are using the Caper template for only ESG, this is the screen that you'll see. So you'll click Yes and Save. Those ESG recipients that don't have an approved annual action plan in IDIS will see this menu screen after completing the CR00 admin screen. So you'll see that only links to the ESG Caper screens, which are circled in red, are available, and the other screens don't show up at all. But in either case, you'll see that this screen will show up regardless of which version you used once you click on the CR60 link. So screen CR60 shows the information collected on both the recipient and the subrecipient. If you take a look at question 1, you'll see that this question is read-only because the information is actually pre-populated from IDIS. You can see what's currently in the system by clicking on the Grantee PJ tab, which is circled at the top of your screen. And if you notice an error or any missing information, contact your local HUD field office because they must make the necessary changes for you. Recipients cannot make the changes to the ESG contact information found in the Grantee PJ tab. Question 1A asks you to identify the name of the CoCs in which the recipient and all of its subrecipients will provide ESG assistance. A word of caution here, this list may not be updated to reflect the recent mergers or similar changes to a CoC's geographic configurations in your area. And this has happened before, so if you don't see the number of the CoC in which you provided ESG assistance during the reporting period, please add a text box instead to one of the other ESG screens to report this information. Question 2 is also read-only because the information is pre-populated from IDIS. And question 3 asks you to add subrecipient data. So here you'll click Add Subrecipient, and then you will be able to access the subrecipient form. So here is the subrecipient form, which asks the recipient to identify the subrecipient name, address information, DUNS number, organization type, which allows you to choose from faith-based organization, unit of government, or other nonprofit organization from a drop-down box, which unfortunately you can't see here. Other questions are whether the subrecipient is a victim services provider and the subgrant amount. Certain updates were made to the ESG Caper screens in the most recent release of IDIS. On this screen, victim services providers replaces the term VAWA DV provider, which showed up before. Recent IDIS fixes are not all reflected in the ConPlan desk guide, which might still show old screenshots. The sub-grant amount is intended to be all grant funds subawarded to the subrecipient during the reporting period. The amount is not intended to be restricted to only one source year funding for the particular program year. And I think an example might be helpful here. So if you take a 2010 CAPER, if a subrecipient were awarded $10,000 from fiscal year 2012 source year grant funds, as well as $25,000 from fiscal year 2011 second allocation source year grant funds. During the same program year, 2012, the recipient must enter the total, $35,000, in this cell. And so that is really what's asked for the ESG subgrant award amount. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Natalie Matthews, who will continue reviewing the ESG Caper screens. Natalie?
Great. Thanks so much, Marlisa. So we've gone over the first of the 4 screens that you see in IDIS, and now we're going to spend some time going over the remaining screens. So the first set, CR65, these screens, if you remember from earlier in the presentation, these are the screens that relate to persons assisted with ESG. And it's important to note that Screen 65 is the only ESG Caper screen that requires data from HMIS. All of the data that's required for questions 4, 5, and 6, which are listed up here on the screen, those are captured in HMIS via HUD's universal data elements. Question 7, which as you can see on the screen refers to subpopulations or special populations served. That requires program-specific data elements in order to complete. And although program-specific data elements are not currently required for ESG by HUD, HUD absolutely encourages both recipients and subrecipients to collect the relevant program-specific data elements that are needed to complete this table. We're going to cover question 7 in detail in just a bit, but we're going to start by going through the first question, question 4. So as you can see up here on the screen, this is how question 4 will appear in IDIS. The data in question 4 is going to be broken out by homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, street outreach, and then lastly the total persons served with ESG. One thing that's important to note is that there was recently a fix in IDIS that added the street outreach table to question 4. What you can see here on the screen is 4D. It's highlighted there in red for you, so you can see it right up there now. The ConPlan Desk Guide, which is one resource that we'll have linked for you at the end of the screen, or at the end of the presentation, that resource does not yet reflect this update, but we are pointing out that you will see this in IDIS, and it is something that an updated desk guide will cover at a later date to go over the IDIS fix here. A few things to note about Screen 4, which again is talking about the number of persons served by ESG. Some recipients have asked how to count persons that are served for emergency shelter. So again, emergency shelter is going to be shown up here separately. It's listed there as 4C on the screen. So HUD does not require or expect that individual beds within an emergency shelter are going to be categorized by funder. So there's no expectation by HUD that an HMIS can identify an ESG bed distinctly from any other bed that may be in that shelter program. However, for example, all clients that are served by a program it's important to make sure that all clients are served, are shown up here on the served screen. So you have to make sure that anybody that's served by the program, that you can account for them on the screen. There's not an expectation that you're going to be able to segment out the number of people that were served by just ESG funds in your shelter program. So the ESG, you must provide an unduplicated count of all persons residing in all beds of the project that was funded in the CAPER. One other thing to note here is that persons can be reported in more than one table when we're looking at 4A through 4D. And if that's the person would show up more than once if the participant received services from 2 or more components, such as emergency shelter and rapid rehousing. Okay. So the first parts of screen 4 are going to be unduplicated counts for each component type. Again, that's rapid rehousing, prevention, shelter, and someone can show up in more than one part of 4D if they received services from 2 or more components. Okay. We're going to talk a bit about question 5, which again is part of CR 65 that goes over persons served. So the gender table is going to represent the gender of all persons that were served. The screen was recently updated in IDIS to allow for gender information to be included on don't know, refused, and other. So you can see that also highlighted here in red on the screen. Those are the changes that were recently made in IDIS. The age table, which is also shown up here on the screen right now as well, represents the age of all persons that were served by the project. A recent fix in IDIS was to change the cell to read 25 and over, where it previously read over 24. So you can see the change right there on the screen. It's the one right above the don't know refuse, 25 and over is the recent change. The total of these questions should equal the total of question 4D, which we talked about earlier, and that is the total all persons served with ESG. Okay, so it's important that all clients that you served through ESG are reflected in questions 5 and 6. Okay. Data for question 7, which we mentioned a bit earlier, is the special populations portion of these screens. This is collected in HMIS through the program-specific data elements. And as Marlisa mentioned before, the program-specific data elements include things like veteran status, they include things like substance abuse, mental illness, domestic violence. Those are the types of program-specific data elements that are also a part of the data collection requirements for question 7. So again, HUD is aware that most ESG recipients are not yet able to collect the data required to complete this table. Recipients should fill out as much information as available and reliable. HUD is encouraging but not requiring ESG recipients to use HMIS to collect data on these program-specific data elements. Once the revised data standards are finalized, HUD will require ESG recipients and subrecipients to use those new standards. HUD will at that time specify which program-specific data elements will be required for ESG, in addition to the universal data elements, which are all required. Okay, so something to keep in mind as you're working on this question 7 in particular is that it may not all come out of HMIS for you. Until then, so until the time that HUD does release those revised HMIS data standards, ESG recipients and subrecipients should follow the final HMIS data standards that were published in March of 2010. Okay. So as Marlisa mentioned earlier, the racial and ethnic data is captured slightly differently. And what I mean by that is that screen CR10 is what captures the racial and the ethnic data. This table is only going to be accessible to recipients that are completing an entire CAPER in IDIS. Therefore, recipients that are using IDIS only for the ESG CAPER must submit this data by adding a text box to the ESG Caper screen that they see in IDIS, or by presenting this information in a separate document. You'll see that in the past this data has been collected on IDIS in the accomplishment screen for Emergency Shelter Grants Program. But because IDIS does not contain beneficiary or accomplishment data screens for Emergency Solutions Grant Program, other than those that are contained in the CAPER template, recipients must use HMIS or internal records to report this data. HUD does not require HMIS implementations to have the functionality to generate data for both the race and ethnicity part of the ESG Caper subrecipient report, which only generates data for screen CR65, which is what we just covered earlier. Therefore, HUD encourages recipients to use HMIS to collect data on the universal data elements, and then ESG recipients should report as much data as they believe is available and reliable. Okay, so a bit complicated in terms of how to deal with the racial and ethnic data, but just keep in mind that this is the current way that you need to report this out in IDIS for HUD. All right, so those are the screens that are a part of CR65. And now we're going to talk about CR70, which references ESG assistance provided. Recipients that have ESG-funded emergency shelter activities must report shelter utilization data on screen CR70. We're going to take a look at what we see up here on the screen now, which are, again, the screens as they appear in IDIS. The first two rows, number of beds rehabbed and number of beds conversion. We want to start by taking a look at those, and you'll see them up here towards the top of the row. If a recipient used ESG funds for a rehabilitation or a conversion activity during the reporting period, then that recipient must enter the number of units or beds created as a result of the activity. For the next row, which we see underneath the number of beds row, total number of beds, the recipient must enter the total number of beds that are available during the reporting period. So we're going to go over one example of how this might look for a recipient. So one example is if there are all year-round beds, you're going to multiply the number of beds by 365. And by multiply it by 365, that's going to signify the total number of beds that were, the total number of nights, that the beds were available during the reporting period. If some beds, however, are not year-round, if they're instead seasonal beds, such as emergency shelter beds that are only available during the winter, then the recipient must multiply the number of seasonal beds by the number of nights that each bed was available during the reporting period. Okay, so that's how you would address the total number of bed nights available portion of this question. For the part right below that, for the total number of bed nights that were provided, the recipient must enter the number of beds that were filled each night during the reporting period. Okay. Recipients must count all emergency shelter beds and enter them on screen CR70, regardless of whether or not they are ESG funded. The capacity and utilization cell, which we see down here towards the bottom of the screen, that's going to be auto-populated in IDIS based on the preceding data that was entered here on the screen. And although HUD does not currently require it, recipients may use HMIS to collect and report on the shelter utilization screens for CR70. Information reported on the screen should be based on data provided by the to the recipient by its subrecipients. It's important to pay special attention to question number 9 on the bottom of your screen, which requires recipients to report their project or program outcomes data as measured under the performance standards that are developed in consultation with their local continuum or continuums of care. The addition of this table is recent. It's recent change in IDIS, and the intent is to really use this for recipients to use this to tell HUD one way that they're working with their continuum in that way. Recipients may use their own format, but they must report on outcomes for all of the performance standards established in their annual action plan. Okay. All right, now the last screen that we're going to cover in IDIS is screen CR75. And CR75 is going to discuss ESG expenditures. So on screen CR75, ESG recipients are going to report the expenditures on each ESG component as well as match sources. HUD does expect that ESG recipients will need to use their own financial systems to complete the CR75 Capers template screens because HMIS and IDIS do not collect financial information broken down by activity type as required to complete the Caper template. Unfortunately, recipients cannot use the PR01, PR02, or the PR91 IDIS reports to capture expenditures by program year or by reporting period. HUD has issued guidance to recipients not to use PR01 and PR02 reports for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program because of the first in, first out, or FIFO, tracking of funds in IDIS. The PR91 tracks all expenditures by source year and does not differentiate between the timing of the draws, so it's not going to show the expenditure totals by fiscal year, which again is what you need to be able to do to complete the screen. Depending on the program year that was entered for the Caper, each table will then display the last 3 fiscal years. For example, the tables will have columns for fiscal year 2010, fiscal year 2011, and fiscal year 2012 for a fiscal year 2012 Caper. If you are instead completing a fiscal year 2013 Caper, then the table would list a fiscal year 2011, fiscal year 2012, and then lastly a fiscal year 2013 column. Let's take a look at tables 11A and 11B, which again you can see up here on the screen now. And these are intended to capture the expenditure data for both the ESG and the Emergency Shelter Grants programs. Circled in red on the screen right now are the rows for the Emergency Shelter Grants program. In Table 11A, the expenditures for homelessness prevention under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program category refers to the Emergency Shelters Grant Program as opposed to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. Recipients must enter the amount of funds expended during the reporting period for prevention services under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program for the last 3 fiscal years. If any 2011 first allocation emergency shelter grants funds were reprogrammed to the new ESG program, or Emergency Solutions Grant Program, those reprogrammed funds would not be reported here for Emergency Shelter Grants Program, but under the ESG program. For Table 11B, that was going to refer to expenditures for homeless assistance under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program. And what that table is going to do is it's going to capture the remaining Emergency Shelter Grants Program funds that were expended for renovation, rehabilitation, operations, and essential services during the reporting period for the first allocation of fiscal year 2011, other than administrative funds and homelessness prevention expenditures under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, since those will be listed in Table 11A. For the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, many recipients have already expended all of their remaining funds, and in such cases, there may not be any Emergency Shelter Grants Program expenditures to report for fiscal year 2013 and beyond. As you can see, it's not necessary to fill in all cells, but only the actual expenditures during the reporting period. And one last note about this screen is that since the federal fiscal year 2011 is the first year of the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, no expenditures can be filled out for 2010 and earlier. A column for fiscal year 2010 does not show up here, but it would if it was a 2012 Caper. So we want to just make note of that, even though you're not seeing it on the screen. It's something to keep in mind if you do have a fiscal, or if you do have a 2012 Caper. Okay. On this slide, we're going to take a look at Table 11C, which captures the shelter expenditures for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. The fiscal year 2011 column captures only expenditure information for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program funds. Remember that the Emergency Shelter Grants funds expended for shelter costs are going to be captured in Table 11B. Table 11C should reflect only the amount of ESG funds that you expended during the reporting period, as opposed to 11G, which is the total including match dollars. Okay, and we don't see 11G up on the screen now, but I'm going to move the slide forward, and we can see both 11F and 11G. So table 11F is going to captures expenditures that are counted as match for ESG. And as we discussed on the previous slide, 11G is going to include any non-ESG funds that recipients expended for your ESG program, i.e. the match, that amount that's reported in table 11F, plus the total reflected in table 11E. Okay, a few notes about submissions instructions. So common plan jurisdictions may use IDIS to prepare and submit their entire CAPER only after they have an approved annual action plan in IDIS. Once the entire CAPER is completed in IDIS, recipients can submit the report in the system. The part that's highlighted as FO review, that's going to refer to the HUD field office having access to a submitted report in order to be able to review reports that are in the IDIS system. ESG recipients are required to use the ESG Caper template in IDIS regardless of whether an approved consolidated or annual action plan has been submitted in IDIS. ESG recipients that do not have an approved annual action plan yet in IDIS are required to complete the ESG Caper in IDIS and to submit it, along with the rest of the Con Plan Jurisdictions Caper, in hard copy form to their local HUD field office. The field office will continue to review the Caper report in hard copy form until the recipients submit their entire report in IDIS. So remember, recipients must not submit the standalone ESG Caper in IDIS. Only the CAPERs that are completed entirely in IDIS may be electronically submitted in the system. Okay, so that's an important thing to note about things you may run into as you're trying to review and submit your CAPER. All right, now the last few slides, we're going to go over 5 frequently asked questions and provide the responses that we've seen through HUD's Ask a Question. And we're also going to give both links to all the resources that Marlisa and I have referenced throughout the presentation, as well as a reminder to, if you need further help, to go to HUD's Ask a Question for more assistance. Okay, so the first question that we're going to see up here on the screen is, I'm going to just read the questions and the responses so that we all have a clear sense of what's being asked. But this first question is referencing a download error that someone's experiencing in IDIS. So the question is that we can't get the ESG Caper to print with the right information in the right places. The recipients entered data on Table 7, but the report that they printed has numbers in the wrong columns. Additionally, on Table 11, we entered our expenditure data for 2010, 2011, and 2012, but the report's showing 2009, 2010, and 2011. So they'd like to know how to fix that and how to just make sure that they've got the right information showing up there. So the response to this question for anyone that's experiencing a similar sort of download error is that HUD is aware of this error in the downloaded report and is working right now on a fix. If the download shows the incorrect years and/or data, then please go ahead and edit the column headers and the fields as necessary. The tables, including the column headers, are not read-only in the Word document, so you absolutely can make these sorts of changes before the CAPER is submitted. This discrepancy is isolated to the downloaded report, so please be assured that the actual screen showing the correct years and calculations does reflect the information that's being saved in IDIS. Okay, so several of you have noticed a similar download error, and this is the way that we recommend you handle it, and that's again by downloading the report and making the adjustments in Word so that you can go ahead and submit it correctly in IDIS. Okay, Our second FAQ is dealing with reporting match, and the question states that for questions 4 through 6 on CR 65, they want to know if they limit their responses to only those persons served by programs actually receiving ESG funds, or do we also include numbers for people that are served by ESG match projects? The response from HUD is that your CAPER should reflect data on all persons served by your ESG-funded project, including any persons served by matching fund sources that are provided as part of the project. If you'd like any further information on this or any sort of clarity that's still needed about how to handle what your universe of clients is for Q4 through Q6, we recommend that you look at an FAQ. It's number 1928, and it should be on the onecpd.info website, and that'll give you some more guidance on match and how to handle that on the CAPER. Okay, the third question deals with emergency shelter, or ES data. And the person would like to know if the CAPER, the ESG Caper, captures only clients that stayed in the emergency and transitional housing beds, or do all clients entered into HMIS by a particular homeless provider get counted no matter what the service that was provided? Okay, and the response is that all persons served and activities funded with ESG must be entered in HMIS and be counted in the CAPER. So for example, shelter operating costs. You want to be sure that you count all persons in the shelter. Essential services beyond those used by overnight shelter residents. You want to be sure that you count those persons who only received essential services without overnight accommodations. And for grandfathered transitional facilities, you want to be sure that you count all persons that were assisted in an ESG-funded transitional facility under the ES component. And there are a few definitions that are noted in a section of the ESG rule, as well as an FAQ that's listed up here on the screen, FAQ 990, which is going to go over some more detailed information about how to deal with grandfathered programs. All right, 2 more questions to take a look at. So this question refers to additional HMIS data. Does HUD recommend that recipients ask HMIS system administrators and subrecipients for only the data required on the ESG Caper screen? So ESG recipients should negotiate with their local CoC, which should in turn be working with their HMIS lead to establish additional HMIS data requirements. HUD expects that ESG recipients may request additional data to report on things like local program outcomes, which are required in the CAPER screen on screens CR70. Recipients might also need supplemental HMIS data to do things like monitor subrecipient performance, look at project outcomes, and to make informed decisions for their next round of subawards. So the important message here is to work with both your local continuum and your HMIS lead to identify what the needs are of both your ESG recipient as well as your local continuum and broader community when thinking about the data that you want to collect in HMIS. All right, and the last question is about guidance documents. So sometimes the Con Plan Desk Guide screenshots look very different from the screens that are seen in IDIS. Which is correct? So as Marlisa and I mentioned throughout the presentation, HUD recently made several updates to both the Con Plan Desk Guide and the eCon Planning Suite Caper screens for ESG. Some IDIS changes are more recent than the Desk Guide release, such as the street outreach table being added to CR65. So please be sure that you use the links on the following slides. We've got 2 slides that are going to show you the links to resources, and be sure that you are using the most up-to-date resource and guidance there. Okay. So once these PowerPoint slides are posted to the OneCPD website, you can be sure and click on these links or to copy them. But we want to make sure that we point out these resources that are listed here on the screen. Okay. So among the resources that are listed here, we've got the eCon Planning Suite Desk Guide, which we've mentioned several times, and that goes over how to complete a lot of these screens. And there's also reference to a webinar that was done previously for HMIS leads and goes over the Caper. And then on the next screen, we've got the all-important HMIS programming instructions for the ESG Caper, which go over in depth what HMIS leads need to be familiar with their vendors in terms of programming the Caper in the HMIS software. There's also some troubleshooting guidance for the con plan template and sort of how to work through those issues. Some quick tips for IDIS if you're not quite familiar with it. And then lastly, if you ever forget your IDIS password and need a password reset, you can go ahead and work with the staff that are listed there on that final screen, or that final resource there, excuse me. There's a 1888 number that will allow you to work with a staff person to get your password reset. Okay, there are also tools, and Marlisa mentioned both of these during her portion of the presentation. There's the ESG Caper aggregation tool, which helps recipients aggregate data that they receive from multiple subrecipients. And then there's also the ESG Caper generation tool, which is meant to help folks who cannot generate the Caper from their HMIS for whatever reason. They can use this generation tool to get the necessary information ready for the recipient so that the recipient can submit those screens in IDIS. And then lastly, we do want to make sure to mention that there are always staff ready and able to try to help out. If you have any questions that come up along the way, as you're filling out your Caper, as you're thinking about what you need to do, HUD does have the Ask a Question portal at the 1CPD website, and that's where you can ask your questions and be sure to get some additional guidance on how to do this. And we want to thank you guys so much for your time today. We hope that the presentation was helpful. If there are any questions that we were not able to answer as a result of just either not having the information readily available or not having time to do that, we do have a list of those questions, but it's very important that you go to the Ask a Question portal at 1CPD and ask your questions that way to make sure that you get an official response that can help you out. And it's also important to mention that you should be getting a link for a follow-up survey to just sort of let HUD know how the webinar went and provide any feedback on the information covered. So please be sure to take a few moments and do that as well. Okay, thanks very much.